What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and we're doing another datasheet deep dive. And this one is going to be a doozy of a deep dive because we're going to be talking about the Leman Russ battle tank. If you're a patron, you might be aware that I'm doing some work with the Astra Militarum right now and thinking a lot about the Leman Russ and the various value of its different variants. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be diving into every single one of the different varieties of Leman Russ and giving them a little bit of a tier list and talking about which ones you should prioritize for your army. As always, if you enjoy this content, go ahead and drop a like on the video and a subscribe on the channel, all the YouTube stuff. And let's dive in by talking about the top line profile of the Leman Russ. Now, unlike several other of these sort of combined data sheets that we've spoken about in the past, every single Leman Russ actually has an identical top line profile with no differences whatsoever. In fact, the only difference between the different Leman Russ variants, with I guess maybe one exception, is that they have a different top mounted gun and a different special ability. That's it. That's the only difference that we have to discuss, which means we can get a lot done by talking about their profile here. Now, one of the big benefits of the Leman Russ is its hull. The Leman Russ is one of the most resilient for cost units in Warhammer 40k, especially its less expensive variants. This thing comes in at a relatively standard movement of 10 for a main battle tank, but an impressive toughness 11 and 2+ save. That's protecting 13 wounds and is incredibly good for the somewhere around 150 points that you're going to be spending on them. Especially alongside synergies within the faction and some core synergies as well, you can buff these guys to be ridiculously hard to kill and make it so that while enemies might be able to take them out, they probably aren't doing so profitably. And if you can force your opponent to expose themselves to deal with your Leman Russ that are in aggressive positions, the rest of the Militarum army can then counterattack for insane damage. After all, if Astra Militarum are getting into a straight up gunfight with another faction, they're probably gonna win. Last but certainly not least, we do have a relatively mediocre leadership of 7, although this can be buffed slightly by orders, and the same goes for its OC value. It has a kind of mediocre OC of 3 that again can be buffed up. That OC of 3 is going to be important. It does mean that the Leman Russ usually can beat out smaller units or individual utility models on holding objectives, but they are going to get overwhelmed by high OC enemies, even once buffed. There are even a lot of other battle tank chassis that come in at OC 4 or 5 that are going to be beating out the Leman Russ on those objectives. Now, on top of that profile, we also get a standard loadout of equipment. This includes a hull-mounted heavy weapon, either a heavy bolter, las cannon, or flamer. Generally speaking, you're going to want to be taking the las cannon in this capacity. The heavy bolters, outside of very specific circumstances, are not super useful, and the heavy flamer can be good if you are trying to play a more aggressive model, but having additional anti-tank is never a bad thing, especially in this edition where tanks are so effective. We also then have 2 sponson mounts. These are either heavy bolters, heavy flamers, multi-meltas, or plasma cannons. The multi-melta is the highest damage potential out of these options. However, it does come with a short range, and if you are looking for a longer ranged attack, those plasma cannons are pretty tasty, especially since you are packing then 2 D3 shot blast weapons, which can overcharge to become 2 damage and be exceptionally good at knocking down medium infantry. If you're expecting large units of Marines, for example, 2 plasma cannons mounted on the sides of this thing is going to be firing potentially 2 D3 plus somewhere around 4 shots thanks to that blast keyword. Each one of those is going to be killing a 2-wound model, and that is a lot of additional damage at that long range. I think the consideration here is mostly between the multi-meltas and the plasma cannons, but occasionally if you are playing an exceptionally short-ranged variety of a Leman Russ, rocking 3 heavy flamers on the hull to give you a good overwatch, or even when you're engaged, just being able to flamethrower your way out of infantry is also not too bad. On top of that, they also get a pintle-mounted weapon. It's either a heavy stubber or a stormbolter, but the heavy stubber is strictly superior to the stormbolter, so you're always going to be taking that, on top of a hunter-killer missile. Most Leman Russ also come stock with the squadron and smoke keywords. The squadron keyword is important to receive orders. Now, there is one exception to this. The tank commander does not have the squadron keyword because he is an officer. We'll talk about that one later on in the video. However, the smoke keyword is important and one of the ways that you can make these guys harder to kill. That gives them access to the smoke screen stratagem, which will give it automatic cover and stealth, making it -1 to be hit and pushing its save to a 1+ armor save, which makes these guys super tough to move, even if they're out in the open and not normally beneficial of thing to cover. Now from there, let's talk about the unique capabilities of each of these Leman Russ. Starting with the standard Leman Russ battle tank, this comes equipped with the Leman Russ battle cannon, a D6 plus 3 shotgun at strength 10 AP 1 for a flat 3 damage that blasts. This is not an amazing profile. That mid-strength low AP is not incredible, but it is pretty good at knocking down medium to heavy infantry with that blast characteristic and flat 3 damage. The big benefit here is the armored spearhead ability, the special ability of the classic Leman Russ. This allows it to reroll hit rolls of 1. However, if its target is within range of an objective marker you do not control, you can reroll the hit roll instead. Since we will most likely already be granting this Leman Russ +1 to hit from an order and rerolling 1s, which at a baseline makes its attacks fairly reliable. And I should mention as well that this affects all of its attacks. This ability does not strictly affect only its battle cannon shot, it's going to be affecting all its sponson and heavy weapon mounts as well. Now on top of that, there's a bit of an idiosyncrasy with this ability. This is essentially a hit roll equivalent ability of the Rubric Marines Bringers of Change, which gives them wound rerolls against enemies on objectives they don't control. The clause that you do not control the objective is very important because it works on enemies that are within range of a contested objective. It's also important to note that objective control is checked at the end of each phase, so occasionally there are situations where units have moved out of phase onto an objective and have not yet applied their OC value to that. This is way more common in Thousand Suns, which can move during the shooting phase, than it is in Astra Militarum, but you can, for example, have a unit of something like Rattling Snipers that shoot their sniper rifles, then move onto an objective, adding their OC value to it and out-OCing the enemy. However, that's not taken into account until the end of the shooting phase, so the Leman Russ will still get its rerolls on an enemy in that situation. If you have the same OC value on the objective that your opponent does, whether or not that's because they don't have an OC value and are on an objective that you have no models on, or if you're just meeting their OC value with your own models versus their models, you will also get that hit reroll as well because you don't control the objective. It doesn't only work on objectives that your opponent controls. Now this makes the Leman Russ battle tank's attacks very consistent. However, those attacks start at a pretty poor baseline. This makes the Leman Russ a very good recipient of buffs, especially offensive buffs, because it can combo those together into some pretty impressive damage since it's probably going to be hitting all of its attacks, or at least most of them. On top of that, the combined regiment detachment is the only detachment available to Astra Militarum at the time of recording, and that detachment ability gives you lethal hits, and getting hit rerolls allows you to potentially generate more of those lethal hits, firing into those heavy targets. Once we start applying buffs, things like the Hellhound or the Leman Russ Exterminator that we'll talk about later on in this video, this battle cannon actually gets very effective. Being able to shore up that AP value makes it pretty good since it's already going to be generating some lethal hits and is probably converting most of its shots into the wound roll to begin with. Now moving down the list of Leman Russ variants, we have the Leman Russ Demolisher. Now at the time of recording, this is the most expensive variant of non-character Leman Russ in the game. And while I don't typically talk about cost in these videos because I think it dates the video quite a bit, I do think it's important to discuss in this instance because a lot of the value of the Leman Russ is in its base chassis, and getting that chassis for cheaper is a huge deal. The Demolisher is not where you're going to be doing that, however. On the flip side though, the Leman Russ Demolisher is ridiculously offensively oriented. This comes from its turret weapon, the Demolisher Battle Cannon, a D6 plus 3 shot blast weapon at strength 14 AP3 for D6 damage. Especially with combined with sponson weapons like multi-meltas or its hull-mounted las cannon, this makes Leman Russ Demolishers ridiculously dangerous against enemy heavy targets, and even good against infantry thanks to that high strength blast weapon. This guy can knock down heavy infantry units like large Terminator bricks just as easily as he can fire that cannon shell through enemy tanks. The downside of the Demolisher is a 24-inch range. In 10th edition, ranges tend to be fairly compressed because missions tend to be very centrally oriented, and this 24-inch range is especially backed up by the Leman Russ's movement of 10 and ability to improve its speed with orders, is not the biggest of downsides. Line Breaker is the special ability of the Demolisher. This allows it to fire its Demolisher battle cannon into its own engagement range. The battle cannon has the blast keyword, meaning it's normally not able to do that, but this ability allows it to. However, it comes with a rider. First of all, it only works on the battle cannon. So unlike the Leman Russ battle tank, part of the Demolisher's special ability only affects its turret-mounted weapon. The other downside is that it can't fire its battle cannon into engagement range if the engaged unit is also engaging other friendlies. This sounds confusing, but basically means that if the Demolisher is engaged by an enemy that is also within an inch of another friendly unit from your army, so for example, there's an infantry squad next to the Demolisher, and the enemy is engaging both the Demolisher and the infantry squad, the Demolisher cannot fire. I guess it would be too worried it's going to hit the other infantry squad. This makes its ability really easy to play around, and actually not that useful. But it does have a second part. That is that it does not suffer the penalty to hit rolls for firing while in melee. That is a pretty big deal, because not only is it going to allow it to fire its Demolisher cannon out of melee without penalty, but it's also able to fire its other weapons into melee without that penalty. Packing this guy full of multi-meltas, for example, and just blasting those multi-meltas into enemies engaging the Demolisher, which are then going to be in that melta range and suffering max damage from the guns, is potentially incredibly dangerous. The downside here is I think that the goal is to try to keep your Leman Russ not engaged by enemies, and while they certainly can just sort of stand in the middle of the table, and most enemy melee units have a tough time actually punching through their super tough defensive profile, the Demolisher is the most expensive variety of the Leman Russ to act in that capacity, and not really one that you want to be throwing away to your opponent to act as a screen. This makes the Demolisher actually kind of an inefficient platform for the Demolisher battle cannon, and we can source that battle cannon in other places while gaining additional benefits from it. So while the highlight of this datasheet is that heavy gun, and its special ability is a nice quality of life improvement, but easily played around and doesn't always affect it, this probably isn't the datasheet that we're going to be wanting to take that battle cannon on. Now with that being said, let's move on to the next variety, the Leman Russ Eradicator. The Eradicator, interestingly, has exactly the same special ability that the Demolisher does. They just copy and pasted it and renamed it Urban Warfare instead of Line Breaker. And the Eradicator is supposed to be, I guess, kind of a mirror image of the Demolisher. It has that same ability and a higher volume weapon that has lower damage, so is trying to shoot into lighter targets. That is the Eradicator Nova Cannon, a Strength 7 AP1, 2 damage, D3+6 blast weapon. So focusing more on killing light to medium infantry rather than the heavy stuff that the Demolisher is shooting into. It does have a longer range, and it is trying to play that more aggressive game, thanks to that urban warfare effect. The downside is that I don't think this profile is particularly exciting. Strength 7 is fine, but at only AP1 and 2 damage, it's not really doing much even if you convert attacks through. The ignore cover is good, means you don't have to source ignore cover elsewhere, either by pumping the AP value with effects or stratagems, or using a Hellhound to remove cover from targets, but it's in service of a weapon profile that's kind of underpowered to begin with. And that moves us on to the Leman Russ Executioner. This thing is coming packed with a dedicated anti-heavy infantry plasma cannon, firing D6+3 blast attacks at either Strength 7 AP2 for 2 damage, or an enhanced hazardous profile for Strength 8 AP3 for 3 damage, adding 1 to all of those characteristics. This gives it the hazardous keyword, but makes it incredibly good at knocking down big 3-wound infantry squads. There is a little bit of anti-synergy with that and its special ability, however. Gung-Ho Executioners gives it +1 to hit against enemies below half strength. The fact, however, that it is firing a big blast weapon means you want to be targeting units that are at their maximum strength, so firing at below half strength targets just loses some efficiency from that blast keyword. Aside from that, this is a pretty solid profile for this ranged attack. It is very good at knocking down those big heavy infantry. However, the Executioner is currently one of the more expensive varieties of Leman Russ, coming in at the same points value as the battle tank. Now, this 3 damage weapon profile is shared also by the next entry, the Leman Russ Exterminator, and this is one of the more interesting ones in the bunch. The Exterminator comes equipped with its Exterminator autocannons, a twin-linked 4-shot rapid-fire 4, Strength 9 AP1, 3 damage weapon. If you've been playing competitively more recently, you might recognize this weapon profile from the Castigator, which has an almost identical set of autocannons. Arguably, the Space Marine Predator has a very similar profile as well, except it's our only one gun, so it's not twin-linked and has less attacks. Eat your heart out, Space Marines. Everyone else gets better autocannons than you do. The Exterminator special ability is probably the most powerful one out of all of these Leman Russ variants. The Withering Hail special ability allows you to choose one target hit by the vehicle's Exterminator autocannon after it's shot in the shooting phase, and improve the armor penetration characteristic of all Astra Militarum attacks targeting that unit by 1 for the rest of the phase. A unit can only be affected by the ability once per phase, so you can't stack multiple on a target to give yourself multiple benefits of AP against it. However, you can combo it with things like overlapping fields of fire to give you +1 AP from that stratagem, and potential ignore cover from hellhounds to push an Astra Militarum army to kind of incredible AP values. Even 2+ save armor of contempted units like Hecaton land fortresses and land raiders do actually just go down to Militarum tanks that are starting to fire at the equivalent of AP 5 or 6. One downside of this effect, at least compared to the other model that I just mentioned, the Castigator, which is also cheaper, by the way. You pay a lot for that like Leman Russ body, I guess. The Datasheet are so stupid. Is that the Exterminator autocannon has to be the weapon to hit the target in order for this Withering Hail effect to apply. Other units with this style of ability typically are able to apply it off of any attack rather than a specific weapon profile, allowing them to point hull-mounted weapons or pintle weapons at a target in order to gain that +1 AP bonus. The Exterminator doesn't work that way, and that's actually a little anti-synergistic if you have multiple Exterminators in your army. The Exterminator autocannon is not only the weapon that applies the buff, but also the best recipient of that buff. Because it has a high reliability, usually hitting on 3s with a large volume of shots and full wound rerolls, it's pretty good into a variety of targets. The downside is that AP value, but that can be shored up by another Exterminator shooting that target. Unfortunately then, you lose the effect of Withering Hail on the second Exterminator shot entirely. You're not only targeting a unit that's already benefited from it, but you're targeting them with the only weapon that can apply the buff as well. This means that the Exterminator is an incredible force multiplier, but has some really baffling design decisions written into its datasheet. That's still an incredibly powerful effect to apply to your army regardless, and a pretty solid weapon on the turret as well. And the Exterminator comes in at the same points value as the Leman Russ Battle Tank and Executioner, which makes it a fairly efficient caddy for all of these benefits. Now that moves us down to the Leman Russ Punisher. This is the family's Gatling Cannon equipped fire hose of bullets. The Punisher comes equipped with the Punisher Gatling Cannon, a range 24 20-shot weapon at strength 6 AP 0 for 1 damage, which gains devastating wounds against enemy non-monsters and vehicles thanks to its mow down the enemy effect. Like many of these other special abilities, this only applies to the Punisher's turret weapon, so it doesn't apply to its other weapons. However, shores up the fact that its Gatling Cannon is AP 0 a little bit. This guy really wants to be shooting at light infantry, T3 enemies, for example, but the fact that you are firing an AP 0 weapon that probably doesn't ignore cover against them means that they're probably just gonna be fine. Most enemy light infantry is saving on 4s against this thing, so most of its damage actually usually gets blanked by enemy saving throws, unless you are rolling those devastating wounds. And unlike vehicles like the Gladiator Reaper, it doesn't have the twin linked ability to get rerolls on those weapons to get those devastating wounds more often. I almost wonder if it would have been too broken to just give the Gatling Cannon devastating wounds at a base level. It's probably only generating 1 or 2 mortal wounds on average, depending on the situation and what buffs are applied, but I think it would have given it at least a little bit of punching power into heavier targets as well. That being said, this guy is still a pretty good hull to mount a bunch of flamethrowers onto. You get a short-range anti-infantry weapon that's not too bad as an Overwatch threat. You're just making him more dangerous as an Overwatch threat as well, and given the fact that the Punisher is one of the cheaper varieties of Leman Russ, you can kind of use him as a more of an aggressive piece. So focusing on those short-range weapons, either multi-meltas or those flamethrowers, makes him pretty good in a wide variety of situations. And that was us on to the last non-character Leman Russ in the list. This is the Leman Russ Vanquisher, and he's certainly not the least of all of these. For the longest time, the Leman Russ Vanquisher was an absolute meme, but I think that the age of laughing at the Vanquisher is over. The Vanquisher comes packing the Vanquisher Battle Cannon, a single-shot heavy weapon that comes in at an impressive strength 18, AP 4, D6 plus 6 damage. That heavy keyword is important, since it can benefit from take aim for +1 ballistic skill, and also that heavy effect to hit on 2s, and potentially reroll 1s if you have any reroll outlets in your army. An AP4 with the potential buffs of other Leman Russ or overlapping fields of fire, this guy can be punching through almost all armor saves, so if you're not protected by an invulnerable save, that attack is most likely converting, and he gets reroll wounds against monsters and vehicles. This makes the Vanquisher Battle Cannon shot incredibly reliable, and basically forces an invulnerable save against anything it shoots at. If you're not protected by an invulnerable save, you're gonna have a really bad time. The Vanquisher also, at least at the time of recording, comes in as the single cheapest Leman Russ chassis. One of the scariest turret weapons of one of the Leman Russ is also coming on the cheapest hull, which makes the Leman Russ Vanquisher an incredible way to just get additional T11 2+ save vehicles into your list to draw fire from your other tanks. And it's also important to mention that he's still packing all those pintle and hull mounted weapons, so he's still getting a las cannon, potential multi-meltas, or plasma cannon shots on top of that, although it should be noted that they do not benefit from the tank killer ability that only affects attacks, its battle cannon. Now last and certainly not least on the list is the character variety of the Leman Russ, the Tank Commander. This unit is a little bit different because it has some different keywords and abilities than the standard Leman Russ vehicles. It comes in with the officer keyword, but not the squadron keyword, meaning that the Tank Commander can generally not benefit from orders, with one exception. However, he can issue orders. He has the voice of command ability and can issue a single order to nearby squadron units using his Voxnet to or issue them up to 12 inches away. This makes Tank Commanders incredibly effective at buffing your other Leman Russ, and a lot of times you'll see a Grand Strategist Tank Commander with the enhancement to allow him to issue additional orders, backing up a pair of additional Leman Russ to act as a pseudo unit. The Tank Commander's special ability is Death Befitting an Officer, giving you a round of shooting on death once the Tank Commander is destroyed on the roll of a 2+. This is a little inconsistent because it is an out of sequence shot, meaning that if you're engaged, for example, he's not actually eligible to make those attacks. So there's a lot of situations in which the Tank Commander will die and then not get the effect of his only special ability. This is a nice bonus to have and definitely one that your opponent has to play around. If they do end up trying to trade profitably into an army with Tank Commanders, those Tank Commanders can fire back and just equalize the scoreboard by killing whatever shot at them, especially if they have orders applied to them as well. Now on top of that, the Tank Commander also has the widest variety of turret weapons available. It can actually take any of the turret weapons that we just talked about. This makes it probably the most effective place to put your Demolisher battle cannons. The Tank Commander comes in at basically the same cost as the standard Demolisher and just trades that kind of mediocre line breaker ability, which is a nice quality of life change, for a potential second shot once the Tank Commander is killed and orders to benefit your other Leman Russ, with the only downside being that other Tank Commanders can't in fact affect your own Tank Commanders, which is fine because the Tank Commander is the Tank Commander itself. Even if you're not focusing your army on Leman Russ and you're instead taking other squadron units, the Tank Commander is still a good inclusion, especially if you have Lord Solar Leontis, who is, at least as far as I know, the only unit that can actually issue orders to the Tank Commanders themselves. If you already have him in your list, Tank Commanders are a no-brainer because they are basically I would say mostly an upgrade. They are a little bit of a side grade from standard Leman Russ Demolishers, but mostly an upgrade because they have more effective special abilities. Now with that, let's talk about some internal synergies that we can use inside the faction. There are a lot of these because the Militarum army has a ton of buffs for other vehicle units. I just mentioned Lord Solar Leontis, so let's rip that band-aid off real quick. Lord Solar has 3 orders that he can issue to any Astra Militarum unit, so he is able to issue orders to other Tank Commanders or Leman Russ vehicles by himself. If you are taking Lord Solar Leontis with an attached Master Vox, he can do so at 24 inches, which almost anywhere on the table allows you to be buffing your Leman Russ, even if they don't have Tank Commanders available to them, and makes Lord Solar basically an auto-include in armies that are focusing on the Leman Russ. The Hellhound is the last synergy that I want to talk about. This guy has the Flush Them Out ability, which after the Hellhound is shot, if it hits an enemy unit, it can remove cover from them. Importantly, this is any weapon. Unlike many of the Leman Russ abilities, it doesn't require the Hellhound to hit the enemy with its turret-mounted weapons. It can fire heavy bolters or hunter-killer missiles at a target in order to grant that benefit as well. This is huge for the low AP weapons that many of these Leman Russ variants are packing. AP1 Ignore Cover is much more effective than just the straight-up AP1, which will oftentimes be reduced to AP0 thanks to the benefit of that cover. The Tech Priest Engine Seer is another easy one. He can gain Lone Operative while near vehicle units and can repair them for D3 wounds in your command phase, also granting them a 4+ invulnerable save until your next command phase. Although in fairness, with a 2+ save and access to Smokescreen, a 4+ invulnerable save is oftentimes redundant, and most of the time you're not actually going to be taking worse than a 4+ save on your base armor save anyway. Now a similar and actually exclusive effect is the Trojan Support Vehicle. This is a Forge World vehicle that has a very similar ability to the Engine Seers, which allows it to heal D3 wounds on a vehicle within 3 inches in your command phase, and instead of giving it an invulnerable save, gives it reroll hit rolls of 1. This is good for the non-Leman Russ battle tank Leman Russ variants. However, having to have that Trojan Support Vehicle stapled to the back of your Leman Russ can be a little difficult, especially since they're not only, I don't want to say super expensive, but they aren't free, and they also take up a lot of real estate on the table, which then makes it so that your Leman Russ have a tougher time maneuvering. This Trojan Support Vehicle is often used alongside super heavies, and while he still is valuable for the Leman Russ, I think that's a little bit less useful. Now, last but certainly not least, Scout Sentinels are the other synergy within the faction. This gives you reroll hit rolls of 1 when targeting an enemy unit chosen by their Daring Recon. This is much easier to use than the Trojan Support Vehicle, and while Scout Sentinels are a similar points value, they are able to affect all of your Leman Russ, not just a single one. Having a couple of these guys around in any Astra Militarum list is good, and especially in lists that are focusing on these big tank commanders, especially since they're also forward operators that can get out of the way of your Leman Russ fairly easily. Now with that, let's move into some synergies that exist within the combined regiment detachment as well as within the Militarum faction elsewhere. We'll talk about voice of command momentarily here. I have talked about ordering these guys quite a bit, and that is important to mention. Tank commanders and Lord Solar Leontis can issue orders to the Leman Russ, and Lord Solar can even issue orders to those other tank commanders. And the most effective of those orders are move, move, move for an additional 3 inches of movement. Take aim for +1 ballistic skill. Important that it's ballistic skill, not to hit, so you can stack it with other to hit effects, like the heavy keyword on the Leman Russ Vanquisher. First rank fire, second rank fire improves the attacks characteristic of rapid fire weapons, which can apply to Leman Russ exterminators, although for the most part, you're just going to be giving them +1 to hit anyway, which will be more effective. And duty and honor improves the leadership characteristic and objective control characteristic of that model, bringing the Leman Russ up to an OC 4 and a slightly improved leadership of 6. If you are fighting 3 enemy models, for example, issuing duty and honor to a Leman Russ in order to take an objective is fairly effective. And the big effect of this order is that it's issued in your command phase before objective control is scored, so you can see whether or not you're going to need that extra OC in order to take the objective away. This is much more effective on larger model count units since you're going to be getting multiple instances of +1 OC, but still good if you need it. Now in the combined regiment detachment, the detachment rule grants lethal hits against monsters and vehicles with your squadron units. Awkwardly, that doesn't affect the tank commander itself because it is not a squadron unit, it's an officer, but it will affect all of the standard Leman Russ. And there are some stratagems that can benefit them as well. Fields of Fire affect your standard Leman Russ with +1 AP when targeting an enemy. This importantly does not affect your tank commanders because again, they are not squadron units. It only affects regiment or squadron models. However, it can combine together with other effects like the Leman Russ Exterminator to make your relatively low to medium AP weapons that much more effective. Inspired Command allows you to issue orders in your opponent's command phase rather than your own command phase. This doesn't have too many benefits for the Leman Russ, but it can occasionally improve their leadership or their objective control to sometimes retain control of objectives even through your opponent's turn. And last, and certainly not least, Armored Might is an expensive 2 CP stratagem that subtracts 1 from the damage characteristic of enemy ranged attacks targeting one of your vehicles. It's important that this only affects ranged attacks. You cannot use it to reduce the damage in melee, but on a chassis that's already extremely difficult to kill with a 2+ save and 13 wounds, this makes these Leman Russ vehicles all but impervious to anything but the most dedicated anti-tank weapons. Now with all that being said, let's talk about which Leman Russ you should actually be including in your army. I'm going to create a little bit of a tier list here to rank these guys, and I'll just categorize them into 4 broad strokes. The staple inclusions that I think many armies should be focusing on, strong inclusions that I think armies especially focusing on Leman Russ specifically would benefit from including, less useful units that I would only take in very specific situations, and then Leman Russ variants that I'm not that interested in. Starting from the bottom and moving up, I put the Punisher and the Eradicator down in this bottom tier. These both are very unimpressive turret-mounted weapons. They're both low AP infantry sweepers, but Nostra Militarum doesn't tend to be an army that struggles with volume of fire to sweep light infantry. With the massive number of las guns, hull-mounted heavy weapons, and other random attacks in the list, light infantry do tend to get swept pretty quickly, so these units don't tend to be super useful. The one benefit that they do have is that they are 2 of the least expensive varieties of Leman Russ, and I actually do think that in a future update, you could see the value of these vehicles pushed up significantly if they were 10 to 20 points less expensive. If you could take super duper cheap Punishers to run up the table and flamethrower some infantry down, I think they would actually be super playable. But at their current points level, they are just outshone by other varieties of the vehicle. In the next tier up, I have the Leman Russ Executioner and the Leman Russ Demolisher. The Executioner actually has some baked-in anti-synergy on its datasheet. It gets +1 to hit against enemies below half strength. However, having a blast weapon, it typically wants to be targeting heavy infantry units that are above half strength in order to get the most use out of its blast. This, I guess, allows it to smooth out its damage curve. It doesn't really matter at what point during the shooting phase you target an enemy unit with this gun, because it's almost always going to be doing some pretty reasonable damage, either getting additional attacks from blast or getting additional hits from the hit bonus. But I find myself wishing that this was like a +1 to wound effect, meaning that its mediocre strength could then be used to finish off enemy heavy vehicles in the instance where it's not trying to use them to kill Terminators or equivalent units. The Leman Russ Demolisher, on the other hand, I don't think is a bad profile by any stretch. Being a squadron keyworded Demolisher cannon caddy means it can benefit from things like overlapping fields of fire and be ordered by tank commanders to be more effective. It's just the high points cost to include that Demolisher cannon when a tank commander is right there. For basically the same number of points, we can have the exact same unit without its special ability and without that squadron keyword, obviously, but he is issuing orders and also gets that shot on death, which in some cases can totally change the game or how your opponent plays around that vehicle. Generally speaking, I think you're going to be wanting to take tank commanders to fill that Leman Russ Demolisher role and leave the Demolishers themselves at home. Moving up to the next tier, we've got, I would say these are fairly good sort of utility Leman Russ. If you are taking a list that is focused on Leman Russ and you are trying to take a lot of these vehicle synergies in your army, you are probably including some of these guys. The Leman Russ battle tank is here. He's got his high reliability, high strength battle cannon attacks, which are just solid, and Astra Militarum being an army that doesn't typically have a lot of hit rerolls, mostly focusing on either rerolling ones to hit from things like Trojan support vehicles or those Scout Sentinels, or just trying to hit on 3s or 4s and hoping that the volume of fire gets them over the hump. The Leman Russ battle tank gives you that little bit of added reliability, which is very nice to have in the faction. The Leman Russ Vanquisher is here because its cannon rules, and also it's extremely cheap. At the time of recording, it's the cheapest way to get Leman Russ hulls into your list, and the fact that the Vanquisher itself has the potential to just pulverize other vehicles and can even fire into its own melee, for example, being a heavy non-blast weapon, makes the Vanquisher just super useful. There's also a little bit of a weird benefit of the Vanquisher itself, which is that the model is kind of really big. The Vanquisher has an extremely long turret weapon, which might sound like a weird bonus to have, but it means that it extends the length of the chassis in some instances by somewhere around an inch, which actually makes the Vanquisher good at like screening and taking up table space, since because it's a hull measure vehicle, you still measure distances to and from it from that cannon, and the cannon being basically a full inch longer than any of the other turret weapons on the other Leman Russ vehicles means that it can potentially block enemy movement through terrain even more effectively. That's a bit of a weird bonus to have, but for a cheap unit that you're oftentimes throwing away a little bit more commonly than the more expensive variants, I think it definitely helps the Vanquisher's case. And that moves us up to our top tier. These are the Leman Russ that you are most likely to include in your Astra Militarum army. The tank commander is the first one. Being an officer, he's a little self-sufficient. He can't buff himself, but if you are taking any other vehicles, even Rogel Dorns or non-Leman Russ vehicles, he's going to be able to buff them up. And since most Astra Militarum armies are taking Lord Solar Leontis and have additional orders to use with him, the fact that the tank commander can't itself be ordered is a little bit of a downside. There is a little anti-synergy, which is that squadron synergies don't work with the tank commander himself, so effects like overlapping fields of fire that would normally give +1 AP to the other Leman Russ doesn't actually affect the tank commander. Moving on from that, the Exterminator is the last one on the list. I think this guy absolutely rules. I do think that there's a lot of anti-synergy on the Exterminator's datasheet, but the fact that it buffs the rest of your army and is a pretty high reliability gun as well just makes it a really solid inclusion. Having one of the highest attack volumes out of any of these Leman Russ variants and also getting wound rerolls, unlike basically all of the other variants, means that this guy not only is good at initiating combos by shooting at an enemy and getting +1 AP on them, but also is good at benefiting from combos. If you can get hit bonuses, rerolls, or additional AP bonuses, it's one of the better places to make use of those because of the high reliability of its main gun. There's a reason that we're seeing more and more Leman Russ Exterminators on tables, and that would absolutely be it. But obviously a lot of this Leman Russ discussion is up to personal preference, so let me know down in the comment section which Leman Russ variant is your favorite, and if there are any additional synergies or notes about these units that you think I should include. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise. Also YouTube channel members and Twitch subscribers you can join in the links down below the video. I have a lot of patron and YouTube channel member videos coming out about various lists that I have been playing, and I even talked about a Leman Russ focused tank company Astra Militarum list in a recent video, so please join if you want to check those out. And with that, I'll go ahead and sign out. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.